Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This, I think you know, is the third lecture in our series that we call Look Within, See Beyond, Stories of Empowerment and Change. When I think about it enough, I think that's what poets do, right? They look within to see beyond. In so doing, they bring about change, even if only for the time that their readers take in their work and bring order to their surrounding chaos. So, one of my favorite plays is Edward Alden's Zoo Story, and there the protagonist, Jerry, says at one point, sometimes a person has to go a long distance out of the way in order to come back a short distance correctly. Given that we were supposed to be gathered here for this event last week, that statement has some relevance. Though still feeling a little crooked, Sydney's words, not mine, Sidney Lee is here today after a bout with a very nasty flu. While he had to go a week out of the way that we planned it, we were all delighted and looking forward to the lecture this afternoon. In your program, you will note Sidney Lee's very impressive credentials and his remarkable achievements. No doubt they have helped him to become the 7th Poet Laureate of Vermont, joining Robert Frost, who was, I believe, Vermont's first. And by the way, in case you don't know this, he was buried just down the road behind First Church. A Poet Laureate, as you may know, is a poet officially chosen by a government, often to write for special occasions. A country can choose a Poet Laureate too. Our country, for example, has chosen Natasha Trethewey, and before her, Billy Collins, whose Poetry 180 book, as you may know, was chosen for this year's Vermont Reads program. Today, Sidney Lee will talk with us about how poetry presents an alternative way to look at the world. We all need this lesson, especially when we get caught up in the maelstrom of daily living. After his presentation, we'll continue the conversation in the gallery next door. We will have some of Sidney Lee's books for sale and for signing, and we will serve some light refreshments. In The Poetic Principle, Edgar Allan Poe says that the poet, quote, recognizes the ambrosia which nourishes the soul and the bright orbs that shine in heaven, end quote. I think we're all fortunate today to be given a little taste of that divine nectar by our state's Poet Laureate, Dr. Sidney Lee.
The Vermont Reads project this year, I was called by Peter Gilbert, who's the director of Vermont Humanities Council, ended up selecting that volume. Peter is the executor. I'm sorry. Peter's the executor of Robert Frost's estate, literary estate, also a former student of mine. And I must not have given a very good grade because he selected an anthology that did not include me. Thanks a lot, Peter. We'll have a conversation about that one of these days. But it's a wonderful anthology, and I'm delighted that poetry, in fact, is the focus of this year's Vermont Reads enterprise. Look Within, See Beyond. I think that I could give you the sort of Chinese fortune cookie version of this lecture by simply saying, look inside, whether it's at several different journal entries that you may have made, or simply 2 or 3 things that have stopped you in your tracks recently. And if you're interested in writing poetry, you will write something that connects those 3 things one to another, however unobvious the connection may be. You can assume that they are connected merely by virtue of the fact that you're the one that noticed all 3 of them. That's an article of faith, at least for me, when it comes to lyric poetry. And to be talking in my 70th year about lyric poetry as a way of knowing the world is not something I would have predicted when I was a high school punk. Of course, it all changed, as it did for you when you got to college and you became very serious. But when I was a high school lad, I was interested in contraband beer. Ice hockey was high on my list of priorities, and members of the opposite sex were at the very top of the list. Poetry was not something that passed through my consciousness with any regularity at all. I wrote poems perhaps in the same sense that each and every person in this room has written a poem, which he or she hopes has long since biodegraded in a landfill somewhere. You know, I broke up with a girlfriend and wrote some screed, you know, and beat my chest and so on. But apart from that, they were occasional poems in that sense, and in that sense alone. I never applied the kind of rigorous discipline it takes to get good at anything, from shooting basketballs to writing poems. I was distracted, a lot more hormones than sense, I surmise. And then I got to college, and I, for whatever reason, although I'd been a little bit arty in high school to the extent that, you know, I was a musician and I was in the dramatic club and pretty active in it and so on. But when I got to college, for one reason or another, I began to discover this itch to get words down on paper. Now, there were no writing courses at my college. There weren't very many anywhere in those days. Certainly nothing compared to our time, which I call the age of creeping MFAism. And so I wrote for myself, and I wrote stories, short stories. I was attracted to that form. And I had nobody to show them to except my two roommates. Were my roommates and dear friends for 4 years, but they were both engineers, you know, and they kind of look at them and say, well, that seems pretty good, and then go about their business. So it came time ultimately when I graduated from college and had to do something. I did not want to go to Vietnam. I had the third roommate had dropped out early and was one of the earliest casualties of that misbegotten conflict, or at least I see it as such. And so I wanted to avoid that. Teachers had draft deferment in the days of the draft. So, lacking credentials to teach in the public schools, I got a job in a private day school, high school, teaching French and English for a year. At the end of which year, I concluded that the true heroes of American education are secondary school teachers. Even in that relatively cushy position, I realized there was not enough money in anybody's bank to keep me working as hard as that for the rest of my life and having to be on hand all the time. So what could I do? Well, I'd always done pretty well. School had always come kind of easily to me. So I'll go to graduate school. I can't say that I had any particular mission, but I went and I enjoyed it. And I did a program in, took a PhD in comparative literature rather than straight-ahead English, because I had some languages and I wanted to use them. Looking back, I made the mistake of accepting a job at Dartmouth College before I had finished my PhD dissertation, a document which to this day remains an inscrutable document, even to its author, my dad. But at any rate, I came to Dartmouth College as an ADD, that's an all but dissertation. And I struggled with this damn dissertation, believe me, I did. It was like an albatross around my neck. And I wasn't getting it done. And the fellow who was the chair of the department at that point, who was and remained a dear friend of mine until his relatively recent death, came to me and he said, you know, people kind of like you around here, but there's this saying that we have nowadays. He said, I'm glad it didn't apply when I was your age, but it's publish or perish. And if you don't do some publication, your chances of being retained, even for a second appointment as an assistant professor, are not very good. Well, I liked where I lived, and I liked the house that we had mortgaged and what have you. So I said, well, why not take a few chapters? We see in those days it didn't mean that you had to write a scholarly book that no one would likely read, but several scholarly articles that no one would likely read and stick them in magazines. I'm being a little more ironic than I mean to be. And I thought, well, I'll just take a few chapters out of that dissertation, which I had finally finished. Although I'm getting ahead of myself here to some extent. I am. Let me back up a minute. Because I had not finished the dissertation, this gentleman came to me and he said, you know, there's very little chance for reappointment if you don't finish the dissertation. And there's a lot of clamor on campus for a writing courses. And so we're going to offer this one, English 70, and it's a creative writing course, and people can come in and write whatever they want. And, you know, it's not a real course. You don't have to think very hard about it. Just read the material in class, say a few nice words. This will give you time to finish your dissertation. So it was intended as an act of kindness. All right, so I started to teach this course using that verb very loosely, I'm sure, because I had no, you know, I'd never thought about teaching in such a way. And lo and behold, the itch to write, which I had felt in college, and which had been in remission for 6 or 7 years, began to itch me again, and I started to write. Loved the interaction with the students, loved their efforts to look inside and to see beyond, and really thought that it was not only a real course, but perhaps the realest course I had taught. At any rate, and here I'm going to take a very, very brief detour whose relevance I think I can make clear directly. Since I was an infant, literally, a newborn, I have had a relationship to a part of Upper New England on the New Brunswick border in the state of Maine. My family's, so for 70 years I've gone back and back. This place, my father had a camp there. My brother and 2 sisters and I run it as a kind of a timeshare there. I've gone back every year since. And being of a certain age myself, I am a member of the last generation who will have known the men and women who lived there before the advent of power tools for the lumberjacks, before the advent of electricity, before any of the things that we take for granted as modern conveniences. And because there was no exterior mode of entertainment in that tiny community, the entertainment had to be self-generated. It had to come from within the community. And the result was that to a man and woman, these folks, who would now be 120 or 130 if they still lived, were fabulous narrators, fabulous raconteurs. Some were even poets, often of a satirical kind, usually sort of gentle teasers of their neighbors and so on. So that when I started teaching, excuse me, this course, and felt that itch to write coming back, I decided that I wanted to get their words, or words like them, onto the page, their stories or stories suggested by their stories onto the page. I knew, however, I had enough humility, I hope, to realize that I was not a genius. I was not Mark Twain. I was not Willa Cather. I was not the kind of writer who could write sustainedly in dialect without sounding condescending, which was exactly the opposite of the way that I felt about these people to whom I owed a lot of my interest, really, in language. Now, mind you, a lot of them couldn't have written a complete sentence themselves. But language for them was a kind of community property, and it sustained them in ways that I found compelling. So I came up with this notion, which may or may not have had any justice to it, but which was an enabling fiction, if that's what it was, to me, that if I tried to tell stories like the stories I had heard around their fires and stoves and so on in poetry, that I might be able to capture some of the rhythms and the cadences of that speech without being forced to imitate it. I became known, to the extent that any poet ever gets known, early on as a kind of narrative poet. I told short stories, sometimes very specifically and sometimes rather extendedly short stories, but I told them in verse. All right, back we go to my career as a young teacher. I was told, again by the same fine guy, that I had to do this publish or perish thing. So I took that dissertation over to the reference librarian's room, and quite unlike your own charming reference librarian within my head lunch, this woman was very austere and very bitter and stern. Her name, and I didn't make this name up, nor did Charles Dickens, her name was Miss Wormwood. And I walked into Miss Wormwood's domain, looked at me over her, as she always did, ungreetingly over her half glasses, and I sat down. There were only she and I were the only people in the room. And I opened that dissertation, which had caused me such anxiety. And I felt a vertigo and nausea combined. And I closed it and I said, this is not what I want to do when I grow up. Well, I was in my middle 30s, so I should have been grown up, but one can be immature forever, even if he ages. I've discovered that and proved it. And I said to myself, you know, I'm just going to keep writing poems because that's what I love. That's my way of dealing with the world, and I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. Now, mind you, I had gotten lucky early as a poet in the sense that I put poems in prominent places, in the New Yorker, in the Atlantic, in the New Republic, and I had a contract for a first book of poems. But that was not considered real publication. In those days, it's very different now at Dartmouth. And I'm being harder on my senior colleagues, and it may sound that I'm being harder on them than I feel. I feel no resentment toward them at all. Well, the chips fell where they were bound to fall. I did not get tenure, but I was lucky enough to be hired almost immediately by Middlebury College, where, partly because of his one-time proximity, the local genius's one-time proximity to Middlebury up at Ripon, Robert Frost, and the Burgdorff Writers' Conference, the tradition of writer teachers had been established for some time, and I taught there a long time, and with great pleasure before coming back to Dartmouth for the final dozen years or so of my teaching career. Now, the question that I would meditate on by way of trying to oblige the expectations of this series is, why was it that scholarship was not what I wanted to do when I grew up? Because it must be understood that I am not attacking scholarship in any way at all. I benefit from it greatly. I have colleagues and strangers whose work in that respect have been very, very important to me. I've even recently published a book which, using the word a little bit loosely, but not too terribly loosely, could be called scholarly. It's a series of literary essays. They're not heavily annotated, and I hope that they're largely accessible essays. But it's a scholarly book in some sense. But even having done all the essays that went into that book, and I did them over, of course, 4 years or so, 30 years anyway, having completed one, no matter how satisfied I was with it as its own object and its own end accomplished, I always felt a little bit, I was thinking of the metaphor I used, I felt a little bit thirsty always when I was done writing on a favorite poet, Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, what have you. And I think it was that thirst that drove me. Sometimes I call it thirst, sometimes I call it that itch that I referred to earlier, that drove me in the direction of becoming a lyric poet. Now, you know, when we, most of us, at any rate, and believe me, my wife would tell you I do this rather imperfectly, but in our normal dealings with the world, with an institution like a college, or the health system, or a bank, or whatever, or the government, whatever it may be, we operate in a kind of a capital E enlightened way in the West. You know, either this or that, kind of a dialectical mode of approaching the world, premise and conclusion, either or. And I think that for me, poetry delivers us into a world that the great Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung described as the realm of either and or. That is to say, poetry provides a vehicle whereby any number of different impressions, thoughts, impulses, emotions may be contained, some at radical odds with the others, all in one vessel, without, as John Keats so famously put it, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. When I read that in the letter, I said, boy, this is my kind of poet, and he has remained that way ever since. And by way of illustrating, I hope, what I mean, I turn to this poem by James Wright, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio.
It's also on the back of your program.
Yeah. Now, James Wright was a very prominent poet, particularly in the 70s. He died far too young of throat cancer, a Pulitzer poet, very influential poet who began as every bit the formalist that Robert Frost is, and whose technique changed. He became more of a free verse artist. The one thing that was consistent throughout his body of work was his retention of his own consciousness of his roots, which was Central Ohio. He came from rather humble beginnings from a part of the world which was centered on blast furnaces and coal mines and explosions of some kind or another back there. He is more often than not refers to them in the poetry that he writes. Now, some of the ethnic and racial terms here are very dated, and they would be obnoxious to us today, but remember this was written in the 70s. In the Shreve High football stadium, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. In the Shreve High football stadium, I think of pull-ups, nursing long beers in Tiltonsville, and gray faces of Negroes in the blast furnace at Benwood, and the ruptured night watchmen of Wheeling Steel, dreaming of heroes. All the proud fathers are ashamed to go home. The women cluck like starved pullets, dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. You'll notice the way this poem is set up, it lulls you into believing that it's premise conclusion. The only line in the entire poem that consists of one word is therefore, as if to pound into your notion that every premise that we see here, this derelict, degraded, sexually sterile context which he describes, in which even the night watchman is a ruptured night watchman. Everything is broken. You're led to believe that, well, that's the premise, therefore what happens? Well, this saddened community, this sterile community, generates heroes. Who are the heroes? The heroes are the high school football boys who will eventually, and inevitably, given the social construct, replace them as the ruptured ones, the gray-faced ones, the loveless ones, and so on. So it's very easy to conclude on reading it that this is a kind of polemic, saying, well, look, you know, and I would use the example of my own local union high school. You know, we can't afford AP textbooks, but we can start a football program and hire some coach and pay him too much money and so on and so forth. Indignant, you know, about the improper priorities. On the other hand, you know, though I've become less and less a narrative poet as my work has progressed, I've never lost an allegiance to what I would call certain narrative values. You know, character, setting, even plot sometimes, certainly place, even dialogue, all those qualities that I think at the end of the 19th century, perhaps we as poets ceded too easily to the prose writers. So when I read a poem, and I must say there's a lot of contemporary poetry that baffles me when I try to answer these questions, I ask some very basic known questions, like who's talking? Where is he or she? Why? To whom are they talking? Whatever. And the very first line of this poem says, in the Shreve High football stadium. So he's there. all right? Which is an odd place to be if his only mission in writing this poem is a denunciatory one. Somehow or another, he is a participant in the very things that he may revile. Now, does he revile them? I think he does. I think the poem has that thread in it, that denunciatory thread. What are we doing? This is certainly a silly reaction to a great social injustice. But the imaginative triumph of the poem is in those two words, suicidally beautiful. Therefore, their sons grow suicidal would be one way of saying it, one-dimensional way of saying it. Another would be, therefore, their sons grow beautiful. But no, they become suicidally beautiful, which is such an interesting thing to contemplate. It opens up so many possibly different directions in which you might go. That's the realm of either and or that I'm referring to. In beginning this improvisatory lecture, when I spoke about taking 3 or 4 different experiences and aiming at writing something that will connect those 3 experiences on the premise that they're connectable by virtue of the fact that they're products of your own psyche or aspects of your own observation. I think this is, to some degree, what I'm getting at, that the mind, the lyrical mind works in a non-dialectical way, that you can have an experience that seems completely at odds with another, but they have something to do with one another. If you look within, and then your effort is to see beyond and to write beyond, writing your way amongst those connections, and discovering what it is that was on your mind when you made those observations is really what, I mean, quite apart from the women, money, and fame, that's what keeps me writing poetry, because it's a way of finding out what I didn't know I knew, what I didn't know was on my mind at all, the act of discovery, of looking inside, and then all of a sudden being able to look beyond the merely interior, fetid little self towards a larger apprehension of one's current experience is very gratifying to me. The flip side of that is, if I start out a poem knowing where I'm going to go, this is one of the terrible challenges that political poets confront. Not that there's not great political poetry. Neruda wrote some extraordinary political poetry, just for example, Bertolt Brecht did too. But if I know too clearly where I'm going to go at the beginning of the poem, then it doesn't have much juice. You know, I already know what's on my mind. There's no act of discovery. Robert Frost, in kind of mending his favorite classical Roman poet Horace, said, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader." So that in order for the poem, I think, to have some vibrancy, there has to be that sense of discovery and self-discovery and worldly discovery in the process of its composition. And one makes that discovery in the act of writing, not beforehand. A poem that has an outline, like a short story, I think, that has an outline, is inclined to be rather wooden, because all you're doing is you're going from A to B to C, and ending up at a conclusion that you already knew was the conclusion before you started. Well, that may be enough, perhaps. I don't want to go on too long, because I know there's supposed to be some question and answer. I would invite that, and thank you for hearing me out thus far.
One question you didn't mention is when, and I was thinking here about the Vietnam era.
Well,
and wondering, you know, how much do you look for the context of where the poet was or where you were?
Well, you know, I mean, my guess would be, because I was a young man at the time that this poem was constructed, I would imagine that that had a pretty serious impact on the way he was looking at the world. I hesitate to bring it in. I don't know that for a fact, but I think that's a very good surmise on your part. And remember, poems they're open-ended. There are no right conclusions about what a poem means. Indeed, I think we distract ourselves if we keep trying to find the meaning in a poem. I'm kind of more interested in what a poem does, where it goes, and then what it signifies in some sort of abstract and philosophical sense. Poetry is not like criticism in reverse. You know, a poet doesn't sit down and she writes the poem in order for you to come along and get rid of all that other, you know, that stuff like meter or rhyme if it applies, or metaphor or image, so you can get down to the idea. That's not what poetry is all about. So I think your importation, I don't think it's at all an odd or far-fetched importation of the notion of the historical context. I'm sure it really applies. But I think you can read the poem and get a sort of, well, the word timeless sounds a little presumptuous, but you can get an ahistorical sense of what he's talking about in terms of human perception, I think, just by looking at it out of historical context.
Kind of leading off of what you just said, do you have a favorite poem that you've written, and have you ever had a poem that you wrote become more pleasing to you as you
become more
pleasing to you, or you felt differently about it years after you wrote it?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a favorite necessarily. There are a lot of different kinds of them, and there's been a lot of different motivations for them. I think that, and this is maybe something worth pondering, it's something I certainly pondered. I wrote a poem once called The Feud, which was an extensive narrative poem, probably 15-page typescript or something. It was the first thing that I had written in about 6 months of what I had thought was writer's block. In fact, those 6 months ensued upon the sudden and totally unexpected death of my younger brother at 31 of a brain aneurysm, and just dropped dead. And we had, you know, it's partly, you know, at moments like that you say, oh, what's this poetry thing, you know, it seems so trivial, you know, relative to some of the larger issues, even though poetry tries to grapple with those issues. And I thought that, well, you know, it just knocked the starch out of me, and I just, the hell with poetry for a while. But the narrative principle of that poem is very simple. A local have-not family, hardscrabble family, does something that offends a self-righteous, good, decent, tax-paying citizen, and they keep up in the ante, you know, and it ends up with a fire in the judgmental person's house, a fatal fire, in fact. None of that happened to me, obviously, personally. And I look back on that about 10 years later because it came to me so very, very quickly. You know, all of a sudden I sat down and 40 minutes later it was done, and I did damn little revision, and I'm a real reviser. You know, I mean, I revise a lot. And I now think that it's hidden allegory with the relationship I had with my brother, because we were both the closest in a family of 5 and the most adversarial. If I was a good athlete and a good student, then those were bullshit as far as he was concerned. Academics was ridiculous. Sports was a bunch of morons running around in their underwear, what have you. So we defined each other sort of as polar opposites. And then all of a sudden he's dead, and you're like, what was that all about? What was all that feuding about? I mean, it wasn't all feuding. We were very close and loved each other too, but there was that aspect of it all through our adolescence. So that I think that perhaps every poem has an allegory that is hidden even to its author. And I may be wrong in construing the allegory I just described to you as the one that undergirded that poem and which motivated its kind of quick composition. I think that all those 6 months when I wasn't writing, without knowing it, I was kind of, quote, as it were, doing research. So that when it came time to sit down and think about it, it just kind of came at me. So one's attitude towards one's own poetry does, I think, change over time. The late Donald Justice, the wonderful